I don't need to say more. No. Thank you, Kay, for coming to enlighten us, remind us perhaps, of the Douglas family at Northcote Farm.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I would love to talk without the, whatever it is. If you can hear me, can you hear my voice at the back, all right? Okay.
Cassie, you might just move the mic away from the projector. When the projector came on, it started to...
The big elm.
Okay. So, before I explain what I hope that I'm going to do, I do want to apologize for my apparent and obvious ineptitude. I did what, having been a teacher for years, I know that I should never ever do, is come unprepared. And I was unprepared as far as doing a dry run with the slides today. And I'm not very mechanically minded, and if I don't use a piece of equipment more than once or twice a week, I completely forget how to use it. So thanks to Dick Person, who's much more adept at this than I am, I think we've got the slides in order. So I'm here tonight to talk about Northcote Farm, as you know from the what you read in the paper about this. And Michael has explained the connection I have through the family. All right. Is that better? You can hear me now? No? Right. I may find when I come to actual readings that I'm not going to be able to read and hold this at the same time, so I'm not sure what's going to happen then. Michael explained that my aunt, Mrs. Douglas, Frances, known as Kay Douglas, was my aunt. She was my mother's older sister. And because I grew up on the farm that's by Stenner Road, I was very close geographically to Northcote Farm. And Aunt Kay and Uncle George didn't have any children, so I was certainly welcome there, and I looked on them, I think, as a second set of parents. And over the years, as they got older and it became difficult for them to handle everything, I became more interested and started gathering information, and my aunt gave me a great deal of it. And I've become a family custodian of all kinds of things, pictures and letters and whatnot. So in this particular talk about Northcote Farm, because Northcote, as you know, is up for sale, currently for sale, so it's going to go into a new life. We don't know what it's going to be at this point. But it does have 64 years of history with the Douglas family. And another, how many years? 40 years, I think, with the Gassels. I'm not sure how many years they were there. And they brought their own history as well. And it will carry on in a new era. What I've done tonight, and I've got to handle this in glasses, and if all goes well, you'll be seeing about 30-some slides. And some of them I will just describe as they come up. Other ones I will do a little bit of reading. It's not writing that I have written, it's the writing from about the Douglas families in various ways. So I will attempt to do that by holding this or speaking very loudly and holding whatever my piece of paper is. I'm not sure how that's going to work. I think everybody has a copy of the family tree that I wrote out, and I have one of my own. And I won't go over all of this. I haven't got one of my own, but thank you. I'm getting more and more inept. There. Okay, I wanted to explain that there were two Douglas brothers who came out to Canada, to North America, early in the 1800s. One was a James and one was a George. And their descendants tended to carry on those same names. But the two families kept in touch for a variety of reasons over 100 and so years, 200 years now, and still do. And this very last one here at the bottom, Jimmy Douglas, is a Canadian actor. Oh, this is wonderful, a lectern. That's going to make it easier. Who, some of you may have been at an event at Northcote Farm about 5 years ago that Bill Gassel organized, and Jimmy Douglas did some readings there of letters of George Douglas. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of this family, and both sides of the family are very interesting. They've both kept a lot of information. Much of the George Douglas Northern information is in the National Archives, but not all of it is there. So I'm fortunate in having access to a great deal of letters and pictures and so on. And we're fortunate that people like Enid Mallory, who is here in the audience, took it upon herself and her great interest of Canada's North to write about George Douglas. And I'm sure many of you have read her book called Coppermine. And she worked very closely with my aunt on that. So we will go through the slides, and I will explain who the people are, and try to do that in the readings. This is the first husband of George Douglas's mother. And she is probably the only woman in the world who has had two husbands, each of which won a Victoria Cross. I don't know if there is another woman who had that interesting distinction, but Eleanor Burmester, which was her maiden name, did have two surgeon husbands. And this first one, Valentine McMaster, who you see here, was with the 48th Highlanders. And I'm not a military historian, and some of this information I was fortunately able to get off the internet. He died, unfortunately, only 4 years after they were married. He died in 1872 and left her with two small children. And he got the Victoria Cross for gathering up, if that's the correct word, injured soldiers. And just looking here, this is what the actual...
You can have two hands.
Oh, you're going to hold. All right. Thank you. On the 25th of September, 1857, at the siege of Lucknow, Assistant Surgeon McMaster showed great bravery in exposing himself to the fire of the enemy when bringing in and attending to the wounded. He and his whole group of privates who worked with him won this collectively, but they all agreed that he should be the one to receive the Victoria Cross. And if you're interested in that, it is in the National War Museum in Edinburgh. He died in Belfast, Ireland, and that's where he's buried. So, Eleanor, yeah, on mine. Next time.
Okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Right, thank you.
Speak if you want.
Not long after Eleanor was widowed, she met Campbell Mellis Douglas, and you'll see him on your list there. And he also was an army surgeon in the British Army. This was before we had the Canadian Army. And he was a great boatman. And what I'm trying to do in this history is to give you a sense of what Northcote Farm has been to the people who live there and what they have done. So Northcote is both a place and it is a great many people. And one has influenced the other, I think, because of the land and the water that represents the acreage of Northcote Farm. The people who live there, the Douglas family, used it in their own particular way. So, I don't know, there are many unanswered questions here, particularly in women's history. I don't know how Eleanor met Campbell Mellis Douglas, and she always called him Mellis in her letters. She refers to him as Mellis. But presumably an army family. Her father was an army, not a surgeon, but an army officer in Halifax, so the families knew one another. And when she married, Campbell Mellis, they went off on a honeymoon. They took her two small children from her first marriage with them. And they went to Niagara Falls, which people did even back then. Now, and this one is right way up too. This is the man that she married. This is the man she married the second time. This is Campbell Mellis Douglas. He was, I've forgotten the dates, but you have them there on your page. They married in 1874. I think he was in his 30s then. Now, this is where the boating comes in. He had grown up on Grosse Ile, which was the quarantine station, as probably most of you know, which was very active in the great period of immigration out to Canada, particularly the Irish when they came out in the 1830s and the 1840s. And that's where Campbell Mellis would spend his summers, he and his 4 or 5 siblings, on Grosse Ile, which was open from May until, earlier than that, I think probably April, when the ice would go out, until November, and then all the staff, most of the staff would go back to Quebec. Grosse Ile is downriver from Quebec City. I've forgotten how many, I haven't been there, but I've read a fair amount about it. I've forgotten how many miles it is from the mainland, but it's far enough away that anybody growing up on the island, and particularly a child, would certainly know how to handle small boats. And this is what Campbell Mellis Douglas learned. And his father got him a canoe, and I think I was telling Dick Person this just the other day. It's a canoe that is still at Northcote Farm called the Harmony. This was a British-made canoe, and it was brought out by this is where all these names keep cropping up again. The quarantine officer, Dr. George Douglas, brought this canoe out in 1854 for his son George, who was 14, I think, at the time. And that was where he learned to be skilled in boats, different kinds of boats. And that was why he then went on to win the Victoria Cross in 1867. This was after the Indian Mutiny. And before I read that, I will just, I have the wrong man here after all this, right? I think that one is, that's the quarantine officer. Dr. George Douglas, George Mellis Douglas. And the George Mellis Douglas that all of you knew here in Lakefield was named for him. And that's what makes it very difficult in families when you get the same names going on. But he was so distressed, more than distressed, he was overwhelmed, as all the doctors were, by this outbreak of typhus and other fevers, typhoid, and I don't remember the numbers now, but the thousands and thousands of the poor Irish, and they were mostly Irish, who came out who died. And in 1847, he and his staff erected a marble monument, and the inscription on that reads, "In this secluded spot lie the mortal remains of 5,424 persons who, flying from pestilence and famine in Ireland in the year 1847, found in America but a grave." That's a very poignant memorial. And also there's a tablet underneath that lists the names of the 3 doctors who died during that particular typhus epidemic. Typhus was the dreadful one that killed so many in 1847 and 8. So there is Eleanor then, with having had one husband who died, leaving her with 2 small children. Her little girl May was, I think, only 3 months old when her father died. We now move up to Northcote Farm. This is a picture that I know Enid is familiar with. I think it was in one of your articles you wrote about Campbell Mellis Douglas. So in this picture, and it's the only one that I know that has the whole family. There is the doctor, Campbell Mellis, standing here, looking like a British idea of what a Canadian native living in the north should look like. He's wearing mucklucks and a woolly hat. The very tall woman standing beside him is his stepdaughter. That is Eleanor's daughter by her first marriage. May has obviously grown up quite a bit, in length anyway. She's about 15, I think, there. And beside him, standing very upright, is his son Lionel, who was just a couple of years younger than George Douglas. George is at the back, beside his mother, and you can see that Eleanor does look rather frail there. She wasn't very well. She died when she was only 49, died in 1894. And this picture was taken probably about 1885. And the little girl beside her, in the white woolly outfit, is her daughter Muriel. So that's a picture of Northcote Farm. That brand is still there, and those pillars and that particular style of architecture are still there. So they moved to Northcote Farm in 1883. Campbell Mellis Douglas was a restless man. He certainly won the Victoria Cross quite admirably and wasn't in a battle. He was rescuing some soldiers who had gone ashore on the Andaman Islands and hadn't come back. They'd gone ashore on a boat from a ship that they had been brought out on. And the captain of the ship was concerned that they'd possibly been killed by the natives on the island. And he called for volunteers, and Dr. Douglas was on the ship, and he said, well, I know how to operate small boats. I grew up with them. So he took a small boat, a gig, they call it, with some volunteer privates from the ship. And they went ashore. The first time they capsized, they emptied the boat, and they tried again, and there's a wonderful photograph of Dr. Douglas standing in the bow of the boat and balancing himself as the waves come, because he'd grown up with this sort of water in the St. Lawrence. And they were able to get ashore, and they made a couple of runs and brought all the soldiers that were there, brought them back safely. That was 1867, and after he married, and Eleanor was his first wife and only wife he ever had, after he married her, and they traveled a bit in Canada, then went back to England. There was a lot of going back and forth, which of course was on ships. But he was still in the army as an army surgeon. He went off to India, he came back again. And in some of those trips, he writes about canoes, small boats that he sees and he paddles. So he's carrying all this information with him. And after he semi-retires in the 1880s. George was born in 1875, Lionel a couple of years later in England, and Campbell decides that he wants really to bring the family back to Canada. I think he's thinking of the days when he grew up in Quebec. So they went to Quebec for a while. He didn't really like that, went to Toronto. And we don't know what his wife thinks of this, because she just went along with him, as wives did in those days, with the family, this young family. They stayed in Toronto for a while, and that's where he got to meet the canoeing people of that period. And heard about the Canoe Association meet at Stony Lake in 1883. Came up to Peterborough by train, ordered a canoe at the Ontario Canoe Company. Came up by train to Lakefield, canoe in the water down here, paddled up to Young's Point, and saw a sign on the boathouse, which is still there at Northcote Farm, and the sign said for sale. So we spent 2 weeks at the regatta at Juniper Island, and I think did very well. Went back to Toronto and presumably said to Eleanor, we're moving up to a big house near to Lakefield. I'm putting words into his mouth, but it must have been something like that. And they did. They moved up in the fall. I think one of George's letters, he says that they didn't even have their furniture. It was still back in Quebec City. Things seemed to have been left along the way as this peripatetic doctor kept moving his family. So they had 9 years at Northcote Farm. And they were very important years for everybody. This is a picture of the farm, and those of you who've been on the water at Northcote have certainly seen this, I'm sure. The house is still standing. It had different colors over the years. There was a period Not long after they bought it, it's painted dark brown and it's very dull and gloomy in pictures. But there was a boathouse there, and they added different ones over the years. So that's where she raised her family and had one last child. A boy called Evan was born in 1889. Now, I was going to do a number of readings, but I'm not sure how much time we have for this. But in that period that they were at Northcote Farm, Dr. Douglas was doing a little bit of medicine, some surgery if people came to call, and but he was really interested in boats, and he had found a great boating community here. So he was at this point, folding boats, and he had patented a couple of them, trying very hard to sell them, and not just selling them, but actually being in them, doing things with them. And one of his great exploits in 1885 was to go out well, it wasn't called Saskatchewan, I don't think then, but anyway, the Rael Rebellion, to go out to Swift Current. And he offered his services to Colonel Middleton, who was in charge of the armed forces for that particular skirmish. And Dr. Douglas Campbell Mills Douglas said, yes, I'd be glad to offer my services as a medical doctor. I happen to have my folding boat with me. They gone out on the train. And there was already a steamer going down the Saskatchewan River to Saskatoon. But Campbell always, I think, felt that it was handy to have your own boat because you never know when you get stuck somewhere else. So he took that, and the boat, incidentally, the steamer, Hudson Bay steamer, was called the Northcote, and it had nothing to do with Northcote Farm here. It's just an interesting coincidence. But he put his canoe in the water, and he went off down the Saskatchewan River, and he did catch up to the Northcote. It by then was stuck in a sandbar. It had some wounded soldiers on it. So he put his canoe back in the water, and he got to Saskatoon a day before the steamer did. And then he looked after the various soldiers, and they came back eventually back to Ontario, I guess. Well, he writes about all of this in a wonderful article called Cruising in Small Craft. And it's from and I'm not going to read all this because there just isn't time, but in that he does talk about various canoes and how he used them in really odd places, India, in Britain, wherever he could put a boat in the water, he would do that. So that was 1885. 1889, they had their last child called Evan, who was quite ill at first, and so was Mrs. Douglas, and it was a month before she got out of bed and was able to look after things. And how did they have help in the place? That was something that was certainly important. And I will read this letter, and when I do this, I want to thank Sheila Garrett, who has been absolutely wonderful. When I met Sheila a year or so ago, I was mentioning that I have this stack of letters that were written mostly by Eleanor Douglas to her son George while he was away at school. And well, I won't go into all the details, but anyway, I just happened to say casually, if someday, and I'm not a typist, my daughter or somebody will type them, and dear, wonderful Sheila said, I love to type, just give me the letters. So that's what I did. So she has been doing these. I think she has done 1889, 90, 91, and there's maybe one more year to do. Well, what she has done is type them in large type, double space, so that I can go over with the original, make any corrections, and she's certainly good at reading Eleanor Douglas's writing. And then what I'm going to do is make a glossary of explaining who all these people are, because she writes these wonderful newsy letters, and I will read this one to you. This is written to George in the midsummer in 1889, and George at this point is in Halifax. He's age 14, or he will be 14, I think, that November. They want him to join the British Navy, but he has to write the exam, so he's gone to Halifax to study to get enough education, because the education that they were getting here was certainly pretty limited. So she says, "My very dear Georgie, what jolly long letters you do write us. It's a great treat to get them. I hope you'll be able to work up your algebra all right, old chap." And I have to not apologize for explaining some of the language. "Isn't old Smith a jolly old nigger?" I don't know who old Smith is, and we don't use the word nigger anymore, but this is 100 and so many years ago. I think what she's talking about, maybe one of the helpers, he lives with his grandmother, and maybe this is somebody they have working on their property in Halifax. I haven't, and then she just rattles on about what's happening at Northcote. "I haven't seen any blueberries yet, but the cherries are carried off by chipmunks as soon as they ripen at all. I'm afraid your flower beds are very weedy, and Lionel was always just shortened to Lion. Lion won't be able to do anything at them just now, for he had a touch of sunstroke on Friday when he went up with Alan to see his road surveyed, and he has to be very careful now about going out in this hot weather. Alan is Andrew Allen. There was a couple, Andrew and Addie Allen, who looked after the Douglases and looked after the property. He was very bad last night, and I had to get Dr. Fraser out to see him. And that's the old Dr. Fraser. Those of us who grew up in Lakefield probably remember Dr. Alec. He was Alec Fraser, but he was always called Dr. Alec because, well, his father had been Dr. Fraser, so he could only be Dr. Alec. The surveyor never turned up after all, and there were 4 hours in the bush waiting for him. He came, however, on Monday, just as Alan was in the middle of the hay, and they had to leave it, and he never got home until 8 o'clock at night. Darling cut his foot, and he had to go to Dr. Fraser's, and a tree fell on Harry Ingram. And this is where Sheila's husband, Roy, is so helpful, because he has antecedents that go back several generations. He would say, "Oh, the Ingrams were so-and-so, they lived up on that line." So we're going to have maps to go with these letters, too. The tree fell on Harry Ingram and bruised his side, so altogether, I think it's an unlucky road. And I think this is surveying what is Highway 28, somewhere up toward Jones Point. The surveyor asked $16 for surveying, Foley $5 for bringing him out from Lakefield. Ingram and Darling have to be paid, and the surveyor's board, etc. Altogether about $50 out of Alan's grant of $100. And the surveyor says it will take $200 to clear to make anything of a road out of it. So that leads into kind of the history of the period. Just how did it go about? Did you have to pay to have a surveyor survey to make a road? I don't know any of that kind of history, but somebody might follow that up. I heard from Father in New London, this is on the coast. One of the things that Dr. Douglas did, as I say, with his boats, his folding boats, he liked to demonstrate them. So this particular summer, he was rowing one of his folding boats from New York to Boston. And he thought that way he could generate some interest in it. He never seemed to sell any of these at all, but he has a lot of energy. He seems to have had dirty weather and to run short of provisions, but he says he's having a good time of it. The 2 Walsh boys from Young's Point came down on Monday, and people will remember, what was the name, Walsh, who had the store at Young's Point for years. Came down on Monday and picked the red and white currants for me, getting that sum as pay. Walter Young shot their beastly little dog for chasing his sheep, and I'm rather glad of it, for it always went for hours when it came down here. Muriel isn't very bright today. Muriel was the daughter born it should be about 4 in this year, I think. The hot weather, I expect. Mr. Lister had a big picnic at McDougall's Point last night. That's in the Narrows of Ketchiwanuka, opposite Northcote Farm. The usual thing, boating, bonfire, and howling. The Lefevers came over to see me, also Mrs. Sheldrake, that's the wife of the headmaster at the Grove, and Mrs. Robert Strickland. They stayed over there until about 11. Freddie Lefevers coming up to see lions one afternoon. All these wonderful names, they are all the people of the area. Hazlitt's Drive, that's the logging drive, is just passing down, but it's not a very big one. Rye and wheat are looking very fine and nearly ready to take in. We shall have to try and get Jimmy Edwards to help, I expect, now that Darling was laid up. A man named Coleman wrote from Belleville asking about the Oofy, and that's one of their many canoes, but it's spelled O-U-P-H-E-E for some reason. So I've got Gordon, and that's Thomas Gordon here in the boat building, Lakefield, to write about her, as she has at his place to say. I hope your box has reached you all right by now. For mercy's sake, don't get as lazy as May. May is the tall girl you saw in the last picture who seems to be helping in the kitchen all the time but doesn't get much credit for it. Anyway, don't be lazy like May. It would be an awful calamity. The end of the ice house caved into the woodshed on Sunday, but Alan has it patched up again. Black currants in the garden as big as cherries, such beauties. I hope you appreciated Lyon's butternuts. Isn't that just like Roger? I don't know what that's all about. I'm afraid this is a very unusual letter, dear boy. Perhaps there may be more going on next week to write about. We wish for you often. Work well, dear. All send love to you. Mine to Grandmama and Aunt Daisy. Didn't get any English mail yet, so can't give you news of Bryce this time. Bryce is that oldest son who only had a year in Canada and then went to work in London. So that's the kind of letter that Mrs. Douglas wrote, Eleanor Douglas, George's mother. And they're absolutely priceless, I think. I'm going the wrong way. The other way. There we are. That unfortunately is sideways, but I'm not going to take it out now. That is a picture of Sheldrake's school. And this is maybe, there was one master, the headmaster Sheldrake, and he had an assistant at that period. George Douglas is here. No, he's here. Deep set eyes. The school was pretty erratic in those days from, again, from Eleanor's letters. She will say things like, Lionel didn't go to the school today, Sheldrake had a bad cold. Well, Sheldrake, it turned out, I hope there are no descendants here in the audience, but he had a bit of a drinking problem and he was a bit of a womanizer, so there was a lot going on. But the school wasn't very successful. So that's why they obviously had to send George somewhere to school. And he didn't pass his exams, by the way, in Halifax. He came back and went to a small day school, boys' school in Peterborough, and then went to TCS in Port Hope. I think some family money helped with that. And then he finally got off to university. There's a picture when they, and I'm jumping here because I know our time is getting short too. When Eleanor died and they went to England, and Dr. Douglas was going to take the family back anyway. Before that, he just felt he couldn't make a living here. He continued paddling. There weren't the same bodies of water, but he paddled on the coast, up in Scotland. He paddled on the east coast of England. This is one of his long vessels, and I don't know which one it is. Maybe Dick knows. Dick is the greatest knowledgeable person on canoes that I've ever met. But the two of them are paddling, and with double paddles, and that's what Dr. Douglas used most of the time. George, on the year that they did leave in 1894, stopped to see the James Douglas relatives who lived in New York City. The James Douglases, if you note on the sheet I gave you, were mining people primarily. The first couple of them were doctors, but then they went into mining and became very successful. And one of them, first cousin of George's father, became the first president of Phelps Dodge when it was incorporated in 1905. So they were big in mining, and particularly silver and copper mining. And they had a camp, as they called it, in the Adirondacks. And this is a picture of George and one of his Douglas cousins with a typical Adirondacks boat. And this is the house they had in the James Douglases in Speyton Dival, which is Dutch, and I don't know what it means, but it's north of Manhattan on the Hudson River. A lovely house. And all of that area is now, I think, just a park. The big houses have gone. I'm waiting, sorry. You can't hang on to two things at the same time very well. Okay, George, when he came back, after they went to England, he trained in Newcastle on time in a shipbuilding works called Rutherford's, and got his, I don't know what it's called, a degree, a diploma, whatever, but had to go to sea to get his marine engineering, marine papers, which he did. He went to sea for 3 years from 1897 to 1900, decided it was very boring being at sea, didn't like that at all, didn't know what to do, and the James Douglases said, well, how about going down to one of our plants in Arizona, since you now know about engines and generating power. So he did, and I don't know which place this is in. Now, sometimes they work, and many times they didn't. And George's letters, he will often, letters and diaries, he will often describe the problems that they ran into, that for various reasons, either it was the staff that they had in Mexico or Arizona, or the equipment itself, and it didn't always work. But the reason I wanted to show these pictures is that this was a part of George Douglas's life that a lot of people here, myself included, really didn't know much about. But he spent about 30 years with the Douglas, James Douglas families in various mines. He wasn't a miner, but he worked on the engineering end of it. And there is a picture of one of the mines, and I have a letter here, but I can't find it, or just a letter of recommendation. I think this may be Morenci, which is still, I think it's the headquarters now of Phelps Dodge. And he took some marvelous pictures. Those of you who have seen George's pictures know what a superb photographer he is. And I'm in the process of working with the person who wrote the history of the Phelps Dodge Corporation. I think the plate negatives of all of these sorts of installations that he took. And that's too bad that isn't showing. Seeing the smoke. That's a wonderful shot of a train coming around a corner. He took a lot of train pictures. Anyway, these are going to go into a museum library at the University of Missouri, I think. But that's another whole story. There we are. Now, sometimes the trains work too, and many times they didn't. And again, in George's letters and diaries, there will be descriptions of these. The James Douglas family bought or created railways. The El Paso and Southwestern was one that they bought because they didn't have any way of getting the mining the material out, taking it to a smelter, whatever they had to do. There were a lot of train wrecks, but somehow they managed to survive them. This is an interesting one. I talked to well, here's the new one. A bunch of the boys were whooping it up. Enid has just written a wonderful history of Robert Service. This reminds me of what it must have looked like up in the Yukon as well. That's George on the left. I don't know who the others are, although their names appear in lots of his letters. And they did have a social life in a very casual kind of way. A couple of the fellows were quite musical. I think he enjoyed it, although by the time he married my aunt in 1917, I think he was ready to settle down and have some sort of a less nomadic life. Oh, this is Lakefield. I want to show this because in 1903, George came back to have a look at Northcote Farm, and he was able to buy it back in 1907. But this is a picture that he took in 1903. Hasn't changed much. much, has it? Paved the main street, and looking, well, I'm sure you know where you're looking, but what I remember of that corner right there where the fellow was walking, I remember Frank Erskine's store. That was obviously before 1903.
Great young store, it's quite obvious.
Yes, it is. It hasn't changed. When George did buy Northcote Farm back, and I wish I had time to read all these things, but I know there just isn't time. But you can look at the material afterwards anyway. When he got back, he met three families that became very important to him. One was the Mackenzie family, and that was my grandfather, whose brother was the headmaster then at the school. So that's how my aunt eventually got in the picture. They had 4 children who, when George met them, were about ages 6 to 12. He met a family each. The father was a man called R.N. Stewart, who was very much an English gentleman with no apparent means, but he somehow managed to live there and raise his children. Had a governess for his children. He grew wonderful flowers, and he played a wonderful game of cricket for Peterborough. And he became part of this entourage. And then the other family, is my side of the family, and the other side, the Greers. This gentleman with the mustache and the funny-looking tent is Wiley Greer, who painted George Douglas's portrait in 1911 and called The Master of Northcote. And the master is sitting there. He did occasionally have these pictures. I mean, he set up the camera and dash back, and the camera would go up. So that's Wiley Greer and 2 of his children and his wife, and that's a kind of a day bivouac camp that they had at Northcote Farm. That sort of thing George loved to do. And there is George paddling the Harmony at Northcote. This is a canoe that is probably the most famous when you think of all the ones that they had. I just recently found, and again looking through George's letters, and a lot of this I find tantalizing and frustrating, because George wrote a lot of his letters on padded paper with carbons, so there would be part of, maybe through half of the letter out, but there'd be maybe 3 pages of it, but not the end or the beginning, and have to figure out who the letter was to. Anyway, in one of the letters that I was reading the other day, and I keep reading these things over to try to get the whole story, and I'll probably do it till the end of my days and still not get it. But I discovered that the Harmony is as old as 1854, and it was built by a man called William Biffin in Hammersmith in London. And it was brought out by George's father. I just said this to everybody, I apologize for repeating it. Brought out by the superintendent at the quarantine station for George, and that was the canoe, the Harmony. And it's still in existence. Quite an amazing boat. George and his father collectively had 50 canoes, punts, skiffs, anything that was self-propelled. And they had one boat with an engine in it. And they named every boat they ever had. This one, oh, all right. We're getting a kind of random shots here. This is that may even be upside down. It's a wonderful reflection. Maybe I'll come back next year and do this whole show. One of the aspects that George loved about Northcote is the Lombardy poplars. Wonderful stately poplars, and I think that probably is upside down. Those of you who've seen his book, Lands Forlorn, know that that's the last picture in the book, and he comments on that, one of the last lines of the book, seeing the beloved poplars. And the poplars don't last very long. All of those have died, but Bill Gassel did plant some replacements, and there are a few coming up there. George also liked to have people around in the wintertime. This is the winter of 1913. He's back from the copper mine now. trying to write the book Lance Forlorn. He wasn't very happy writing it, and then the letters that I have found, he describes that as quite a arduous process. He kept diaries and letters, but sitting down writing a book was hard for him. So he took a bit of a holiday at Christmas time and invited the Wiley Greers and others to come and stay at Northcote with him. And this is the skiing attire of almost 100 years ago. Oh, unfortunately, get that one right side up. That picture is about the only one in here that's not taken by George. It's taken by there we are. My father took that at the locks at Young's Point in 1914 in September. That man on the right is John Hornby, and many of you will have heard of him. And his name is on that list you have of people that somehow are all part of the Northcote Farm story. John Hornby was, and this could be another, well, it is a book. Somebody has written a book about Hornby. But he's a man that George met on that 1911 trip when he went up to the copper mine. And he was quite fascinated by him, but also annoyed by him because he wasn't at all like George. He was ill-prepared a lot of the time. And anyway, they had a strange kind of friendship relationship. They came out in late summer of 1914. My father happened to snap that picture at the locks. George was deaf in one ear, and that's quite a characteristic pose where he got his hand up to his ear. And I think Hornby was heading over to enlist in the army. And he became a private and came back to Canada, and as many of you know, of course, that dreadful tragedy in the North in the 1926, I think it was. He and two young boys, he'd taken into the Thalon, they all starved. Dreadful, dreadful story. And George worried about him all the time. He used to say that, oh, we really are going all over the place here. George used to say about Hornby, as long as I don't hear anything, then I know he's all right. And there would be years that would go by and he wouldn't hear anything, and then he did hear this tragic news. This is a glimpse again of Arizona and Mexico. As I said, George and my Aunt Kay spent quite a bit of time there. George much more than my aunt, but this was the first house they had and their first car in Cananea in Mexico. That, unfortunately, is upside down. Well, you can probably get a sense of what it's about. My aunt loved flowers. She had a lovely garden at Northcote. And in the house, she was growing paper whites, and they grow certainly much better there than they do here. She enjoyed living there for the time that they were there. Oh, how can I get this one the other way? Oh, we get that one turned up. I've never ever have I done anything so bad as what am I doing? This is to show that George liked horses. Okay. There we are. This is a horse called Star. He did a lot of trail riding in the Southwest with his friend Sandberg, August Sandberg, who went with him on the copper mine trip. They were good horsemen together. And he often would compare canoe trips and trail riding, and decided that by and large canoeing was better, regardless of the weather or whatever, because you don't have to feed a canoe. It doesn't run away from you. But he did love horses, and they did have horses at Northcote Farm at various periods. His father was there, and then when George came back. And that is a very characteristic pose of George Douglas, relaxing. But he's a tall man, very long legs. Those chairs you used to be able to buy at J.J. Turner's for about $1.50, and the canvas cover for maybe less than that. We still have some of those frames at our cottage. we had one remade and it cost us $200. Because all the copper corner pieces all had to be hand done. And we used to get the canvas covers done at J.J. Turner. Some of you may have gone in there to get tents and things. You go up to the top floor, and a funny little old man who'd been there for 80 years would make the canvas covers. Well, all of that is done now, and to get a canvas chair cover is probably another $100. So, our daughters keep saying, "Why don't you throw out those chairs? They're terrible." There's a lovely picture of my aunt in Mexico. She always took a very good picture, and that's how the flowers grew there, just in the vines, just amazing. They had a Chinese gardener who grew large plots of flowers and vegetables for the community, but he also did the work for them around the house, and outside the house. There, thankfully, these are nice enough. This is a little model canoe. George's father, Campbell Mellis, would often make small canoes, and his folding ones would be 12 or 10 feet long. This is an 8-foot model made for the Peterborough Canoe Company for demonstration somewhere. And if my niece agrees, it's going to go into the Canoe Museum. I once got into it as a child and fell out immediately, but George, who was 6'4", could paddle it beautifully. He had an amazing grace. He could skate and move without falling over his feet or anything like that. This is also another typical one. This canoe is still in existence. One of the things he thought about canoeing and what was made canoeing very comfortable and easy for him was that if you put a tent over your canoe, then you could sleep in your canoe at night. Well, it had to have a fairly big canoe, and this is a Peterborough canoe freighter. I think it's 18 or 20-some feet. But he and my aunt took that up the Trent Canal in the early 20s with an outrigger and a small Johnson horsepower, about a 2-point-something engine on it. And he wasn't against outboard engines. In fact, I think he thought they were quite useful. But most of the time he did paddling or sailing. And this is, again, what Northcote is, the land and how it was used by so many people who came up. My aunt on the left and my mother on the right. This is absolutely what you wore to ski in about 1925. But one pole, and skis were made by probably the Peterborough Canoe Company. Remember, those of us maybe at that age tipped up wooden tips on them. The hills we thought as children were great, and the grown boys often came out there to ski. I'm sure they couldn't imagine that nowadays. And this, I love this one because it exemplifies so much of Northcote. That little building he called the floater because it did. He put it on a dock. I think he had to make 2 or 3 different docks over the years. Built that in 1935, and he kept it at Northcote most of the time. He'd move it up and down the shoreline for various reasons. I don't know the story behind this picture. I wish I did. I don't know where they were going and why that funny little tent is there. That tent they used in the copper mine expedition. There's, I think that's a folding boat, isn't it, Dick? One
Yes, it is.
with the ribs. So there's, and George made a couple of folding boats himself, based on his father's design, with one of the little Johnson outboard engines. So there's a little bit of everything in that picture. And they might have only been moving 100 yards along the shoreline and just going to anchor it somewhere for the summer. But he loved the floater, and they would often use it in the wintertime. All his buildings were equipped with whatever they needed. And I'll tell you now, it's just been donated to Lakefield College School. Bill Gassel and others have restored it, and it's going to be used as a paddle shed. So that gives it a bit of history. And I know we're just about out of time, so I'm going to stop. I brought this picture along for Garnet Graham, who isn't here tonight. And I think that may be backwards, but George loved sleigh rides, and he admired the people who had horses. This was a sleigh ride organized by Donald Ross's mother and Alec Graham, who was Garnet's father. And I think they were his teams and maybe a couple of others. And it was a great sleigh ride. That was probably about 1942. There's a closer picture of that. It's on a tram right there. One of those lovely leather hats. Don't do anything to your face and freaks and so on. But and some of us being pulled on a toboggan behind. And there's George, just about at the end, a very typical picture of him in the study at the big house. They call the big house the winter quarters. And I don't know when he gave it that name, but that's what I've always known it as. And all his memorabilia, paddles, the flags, the pennants that he had. He named all the canoes that he took, and particularly the ones to the north he named after various constellations. That picture was taken probably in the 1950s when he was in his 70s by A.E. Porcel, who was the Dominion botanist and became a great friend of George's. He met a number of people in the north, and he kept the correspondence up for years. And these people all came to Northcote. I think that is it for the slides. I wanted to read particularly since I don't know what I'm holding on here. Lorraine Hockaday is here tonight because this is a letter written by her father to George Douglas in 1938. And George in 1938 was on an exploration trip again for the Douglas companies, doing some work in Great Bear Lake to see what the mineral content was. And he was just up there in the summer. And Percy Hockaday, who many of you probably knew, was the farm manager for Northcote. Lived in a little house just on the edge of the property, and he looked after everything for them. He said, I received your letter and was glad to hear from you and know that you're fine and it hasn't been too hard in trying. Well, everything is fine around the farm, and Mr. and Mrs. Mackay are still there. This is a cousin of, actually, an aunt and uncle of Michael's, who spent the summer of 1938 at Northcote Farm. And this is something that my aunt and uncle did. They'd often have people, family members, just camp anywhere on the property. We've had plenty of rain this year. It was hard to save the crop, but we got along fine. I worked on the road for a while, and then we were laid off, and they didn't have the money to finish the job. That was the period when they were paving Highway 28. I think it started as a depression project. Although 1938 was after the Depression, they were probably continuing it. They still work on the roads. What did you say? Well, I lost that good gray colt that we took the picture of last spring. He took inflammation of the bowels. I spent $50 in vet bills, but he couldn't save him, and he just lived 1 week. I stayed with him night and day, but he died. After all, he was one of the best I ever owned. And Percy was renowned as a horseman in this area. And wonderful pictures, and you'll see them in the albums. I brought 3 albums of pictures of Northcote, where he's driving a team and hauling logs. It's one of the best pictures I've ever seen. And he's pulling back on the reins, and there are at least 4 horses. Percy wasn't a big man. Well, he big this way, but he wasn't. But he was great. I remember him really well. We got the boathouse shingled up at the lake early in the season. Your trunks haven't come to Lakefield yet, but when they come, I will go down and get them and put them in the barn. Everything is fine around the farm. I go over there every day, and that's the kind of responsible man that Percy was, and he was around right till the end of George's time at Northcote. I hope you have a profitable trip and not too trying, and I hope to see you before long. If you want me to meet you in Peterborough or Toronto, just phone me and let you know. I will be there night or day. It would be great to have somebody nowadays. I guess I'll have to take the Mackays back next week to Toronto. I will hear from Mrs. Douglas if I do. And my aunt was probably in Toronto staying with her parents at that time. Well, there could be lots more that I could read, and I'm obviously not going to. You've been very patient, but I just wanted to give people a sense of what Northcote Farm was in the period of the Douglases. That is, the early ones, Campbell Mellis and his young family. Then George coming back. There's a great description, another letter, and I have to get these ones typed and out to the group maybe, where he describes to Andrew Allen just what he wants him to do and not do at Northcote. He didn't want him to cut a single tree or a single bush, and you can live in the back rooms of the house. He was very good to Andrew, but he wanted the property just kept. And that's really what Northcote has been over the years. It hasn't really changed that much, but it's just embedded with his history of the people who have come, whether they are family, whether they're friends, whatever they might be. I think they've all been affected by it. So we wish Northcote Farm well in its next time period, however it is going to be. And I'm just glad that I have this material that I can share with people, however badly I did it tonight, but I'll be better the next time. But it's good to know, too, that other people are interested, and groups like your Historical Society are saving these things and thinking about them, because it is important. If we don't have our history, we really don't know where it is we're going. So, thank you very much for your attention, in spite of my inept handling of this machine. I think you got to see all the pictures upside down or otherwise. But do look at the albums, because there are lots of photographs there, and a few things that have been plasticized. There's a bill from Ed Young's store for the month of August 1913, and all the groceries that George bought at Ed Young's. I don't know how I ended up with that, but that's kind of fun to read. So, thank you very much.
We will entertain questions, okay?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I believe that I've been left-handed. Yes, I will put stuff over here. If you have questions, I'd love to hear them. I don't know the answer, but or comments, if anybody, your own recollections of Northcote.
Where did the name Northcote, where did they get the name from?
Yeah, I should have mentioned this. The place was built by a man called Arthur Wright. The house was built in 1878. And George says in his letters that it probably came from their property in England, where a lot of the houses like Ben Dennis at the Grove and Uplands, they would have just taken their county or wherever they lived. But it's just that odd coincidence about the steamer on the river having the same name. How many people? Yes.
I picked up a biography of Robert Service one day. It's not too old a one.
Not the one that Enid's just written? It's just sitting right in front of you. It's not very old.
You were quite quick.
Anyway, in that biography, I recall something about Service lived, I guess, in the Yukon.
Yes.
In the meantime, some of his family, I think his parents and some of his family came and lived somewhere around Edmonton.
Enid would know that. I
And
certainly.
he made a trip to visit them.
Mhm.
And then instead of going back the way he came, he went, I think, north and west through the country back to. And he mentioned, or in the writing, it mentioned that on the way he met two men, and called one of them was George Douglas.
That's right. In that
Is that our story?
1911 trip. Yes.
That is, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, I have that book. I can't remember what it's called. One of his autobiographies, I think.
Well, this was not an autobiography. Whoever wrote it didn't know anything about Service to start with, but I think he wrote a couple of kind of autobiographical types of books.
Oh,
And he used those, but then he discovered that when Service wrote those autobiographical books, he didn't wouldn't worry about accuracy, you know what I mean? And he talked about what service wrote and kind of looked up things and, you know.
Well, it's quite interesting because Douglas describes service and service describes Douglas.
That's
So you
right.
What's that?
get very interesting viewpoints.
Yeah.
There must have been a lot of really interesting people traveling down the Mackenzie River and Lake Athabasca in 1911. Certainly a lot of people in the north.
Okay, the folding boat, was it a folding canoe, or can you describe it? It's hard to imagine how it could not leak.
Yeah, I'm going to turn that over to Dick Person. Let me introduce you to Dick Person.
You're lucky.
Dick is a boat builder and has done a lot of historical research about the different boat companies and grew up in Sweden. Not Denmark, Sweden. And our good fortune, he is now in this area and he's been a great help to the Canoe Museum and to anybody who wants a boat built or restored. So can you answer the question?
I can. It is a stringer, a number of wood stringers, longitudinal stringers, and they are covered in a sawn canvas shell, so to say. So everything is spread out, and you can actually take the spreaders out, and everything collapses and becomes a small package. And it was built in 12 foot all the way up to 20 foot, if I remember right, as well as a couple of boats, quite wide ones. So they were built by Douglas himself. It was built by Ontario Canoe Company. Peterborough Canoe Company built them for the longest time. So quite an invention actually. And it was patented in 1875, I think.
So how small did you put your hands there that it folds up to?
A little
Like a
package
sort
like
of a
this.
foot square?
A package about 8 feet long, if it's an 8-footer,
Okay,
and about this big.
okay, okay.
And the big 20-footers could be folded in the middle, so they became a 10-foot package. There is one of Douglas, or maybe Ontario Canoe Companies, which is the same kind, in the post in the museum, laying inside one of the freighter canoes, which is an exact copy, or exactly that model of canoe. So next time you're into the museum, take a peek.
Yes. Yes, sir.
The Northcote comes from the man who started the Hudson Bay Company. And Walter Trail, Captain Carter's youngest, managed the experimental farm in Northcote, Minnesota.
Oh,
And so that's where the name Northcote comes from, is from the Hudson Bay. It's presumed Wright must have worked for the Hudson Bay Company at
oh,
some
well,
point.
that could be.
And quite a few places got the name Northcote because they admired Sir Adam Northcote.
Oh, that's good to know, Gordon, okay? I didn't know that.
I do believe there must have been a Northcote in this area. I see Elmer Graham here, and he mentioned to me that Northcote, people by that name owned his mother's house,
Oh,
which is across from the other side of town. And also, somewhere in my family, or my wife's family, Northcote had been mentioned somewhere along the line through the Hooke days. And he perhaps was the prior owner of Douglas place there.
well, the man who built it was a man called Wright, but he may, and I don't know anything about him except he came from England. So there may have been something there, or as Gordon said, it may have been from here, or people with that name actually in the area.
Well,
There are
that's,
Northcotes in Peterborough, I know.
Sort of our recollection in my wife's family.
Any other question? Yes?
Hi, Kathy.
Oh, now we have a gas.
I have three connections with this topic of the book. I lived at the farm, so I have a lifetime of memories up there. I
I'm also a patent agent. And I have a great story to share with you. I was training back in the days before the internet. You can go on the net now and get virtually any patent that was ever issued in Canada or the US. But when I was training, you couldn't. And I happened to be down I trained in Toronto, and I was down in Ottawa at the patent office, and we had a great connection with the Douglases. I mean, Mrs. Douglas was somebody who, if she called, everything stopped, and we did everything possibly could for her.
That's why you were the only people she wanted to sell the farm to. Because it was a great relationship. And your father said it'll stay the same in my lifetime.
Yeah. Well, I was down to my story. I was in Ottawa at the patent office. We had the annual meeting for the institute was down there. I was down for tutorials, and I had to go to the patent office, and I was working through stuff, and I said they had sort of officers, and I said, "Hey, would you do me a favor? Would you go to the records and see if you can find," because I didn't know at the time it was patented, actually. There's a fellow by the name of George Douglas, and he made a folding canoe, and I know this. I know his wife, and I would just love to be able to show her a copy of the patent if in fact he did, because I didn't know that he did. So I left him alone, and I went on my work, and as I was walking out of the office, he said, "Jim, got something for you." And there it was. There was the patent. And it was a monumental moment for me, because I had been, struggling as a trainee. And to come back to Lakefield and to go to see Mrs. Douglas and have a glass of Fry's cocoa and say, "Mrs. Douglas, have a look at this."
Was this Campbell Mellis Douglas's patent or George's?
I don't remember. I think it was probably the one you're referring to. I think it was a. I don't remember the date, and I don't know.
Improvement to the folding boat.
I may have asked for Douglas and canoe, and but it was a big deal to find that, because I didn't really know it.
Needs further work, Jim.
And I think Jim has a collection of airport engines, or is it the cameras? You have something.
Oh, well, how much time do you have?
It's an unending story. It is a saga.
Kay, you said it so well. The farm has had so many people and so many experiences that they're truly endless. 5:30 one night, we received a phone call. Mrs. Douglas was in the mood for getting rid of things, and she had some stuff that was going to go to the garbage. And she knew at the time that I was collecting cameras, and she wondered if I might like to see these before they hauled off to the dump. Well, it didn't matter what Mrs. Douglas was getting rid of. We stopped, and Dad and I went to the car in minutes. We were at the door, and we stopped and had a cup of tea or Fry's cocoa, talked about anything that there was to talk about, and we brought these and the boxes were at the door. There were cases, and we didn't indulge in opening them up there. We brought them home, and I was 14, and I felt like a kid on Walt Disney, because I opened up these beautiful leather boxes, and the smell, and they were exquisitely looked after. These were well cared for instruments. There was beautiful cameras and unique cameras, and one of them is a panoramic camera. It's quite amazing. For anybody who knows photography, it had a box in it, and it had a semicircular tray to hold the film, and the lens was on I shouldn't say past tense. The lens is on a turntable. And you hit the button, and the lens does this really slowly. And then you choose the fan, to control the speed of the lens. So the bigger the fan, obviously the more air it has to turn, thus it turns slowly. No fan at all, it goes zip, it is spring loaded, complete with manual, in its own beautiful leather container box. And this stuff was all
Heading for the dump.
headed for the dump. So, you know, I mean, Mrs. Douglas, whenever she called, we jumped on board.
Oh, thank goodness.
It was a wonderful relationship, Jim, it still is, with the
Yes.
Gaskels and the Douglases and descendants.
Any other questions?
I remember him coming to town on a bicycle,
Oh, yes.
indeed.
all the time, big bicycle.
He did,
He did a good job, he had long legs.
yes. He kept one at the upper gate at Northcote, and he kept one at Burmester, his cottage that he had on the mainland near the Cassidy Hotel. And he kept a number of things at Iott's farm, too. I think he kept a bicycle there and skis. So he has one, I have to stop this, but just one last story. The wonderful description in a 1930s letter in the winter to, I think to his brother Lionel. He said, I had an interesting day. I paddled up to the point, tied my canoe onto the stern of the steamer. They rest there for the winter, and I went up to Ed Young's store, then I paddled back. This was February. And I thought in the afternoon, well, I'd like to go up and see the cottage. It has a little cottage called Wee Island, which is just past Gortha Park, and just where the islands begin. So he got on his bicycle, that was at the north gate, and he bicycled up Highway 28 in the winter to Iott's, left it there, took his skis, had his skis there, skied down the Gortha Park Road, straight down till he got to the Cassidy's, the old hotel. The snow was just too deep and too mucky, so he went across just on his, wearing his shoes. I think maybe this was another trip where he found something to help take him across. No, I guess he just walked across, had a look at the cottage, came back and repeated the whole process. Got on his skis, went up the hill, got on the bicycle. Oh, he'd snowshoed out from the house. And he had multiples of everything. He wasn't extravagant, he was well prepared. Each, the winter quarters, the tool house, the floater, all had whatever they needed. Very simple things, but everything was there.
We remember at the marina, Gortha Park, if the lake was almost, well, maybe even Mike wouldn't be out on it. If there wasn't a boat in sight, the worst storm, you could count on it. Watch at the point, and there would be George in the canoe with Kay coming across, and we knew, really, we got to know that it was just to say he could do it.
Yes.
Because he would buy a loaf of rye bread, a block of ice. You know, you could live without either one of those in the midst of a storm, and then he would paddle back.
Yes.
And but he did it any time there was the worst storm of the summer. He just liked to see that he could, and he was getting quite elderly
That's
then.
right.
But he would, like that last picture, the one of him in front of the fireplace.
Yes.
He would look like that and come across in the teeth of the storm. Amazing man.
Very confident. There was a funny letter, and I won't read it, I'll make the story very short, and then I will stop, where he did go through the ice. Well, actually, he didn't, my mother did. He was pushing her in a hand sleigh that he had at the farm, and this was a New Year's Day skating party. They had headed back from Clear Lake, and at least from Wee Island, they were almost down to South Beach, and they were cutting across where the lighthouse used to be, and going over to that east shore, I guess it is. And there was open water, you could see in the distance. And my mother got tired, so she was sitting on this sleigh that had handles, and she'd taken off her skates. They skated down, and he had pulled his sleigh up because he had stuff on him apparently. And the sleigh went through the ice. Well, he always carried a stick with him, and he made sure everybody had a stick, a hockey stick or a pole or something. And he said, in his letter, he was writing again to Lionel, he said, well, it wasn't too deep and not very cold, and I got her over to it. And I made her walk fast out of Northcote. She was almost dry. And he went back the next day, and I think she'd dropped one of her skates, and he found that. I actually started before we began. He did have the odd accident, but he was prepared to deal with it. He knew what to do. Anyway.
Kathy, thank you very much indeed on behalf of all of us, and I must say particularly for me, because as a young boy, I saw George often, and I really can never forget the silk undershirt.
That's right, yeah.
Impeccable,
Yeah.
always. And you saw a picture of the flota. There was also a tenta. On another wharf, there was a tent erected, and I still have a memory of George's silk underwear drying beside the tent. But it's more than that. I remember a New Year's Day, we lived in Young's Point, and Mother and I paddled on New Year's Day down Lake Catchwanooka to visit George and Kay Douglas at Northcote Farm. It wasn't a particularly hard winter that year. There was water. And I paddled past Northcote Farm last Friday, paddling my canoe from Stoney to the college. It's our life. And I am most grateful for the memory and for your recounting of it. And I thank you very much indeed.
So do look at the albums, we love the pictures, and
Aren't we lucky to live in such a wonderful area? I think we just have the best of everything. We have wonderful